In the end, it was not a private corporation, but a public agency that closed the book on the red cars. The Metropolitan Transit Authority took over.
The first MTA was created in 1958, and it lasted about 5.5, almost 6 years, and they continued using the green paint job that Metropolitan Coach Lines they inherited from it, and they continued the same philosophy: get rid of the rail, whatever it takes.
Anxious to disconnect LA emotionally from the red cars, the MTA decided to paint them green to match their bus fleet. They ended up painting only one car, bus green. The remaining cars kept their fading red paint until the end, which, with the MTA in control, came quickly.
They had carte blanche. They could do whatever they want. They did not have to answer to anybody. Whereas the old LA Railway, Los Angeles Transit Lines, Metropolitan Coach Lines, if they wanted to abandon a car line, they would have to have hearings and meet with the approval of the PUC, the Board of Public Utility. But when the first MTA took over, their charter expressed that they would have to answer to nobody.
It was the last few communities served by the red cars that were hit the hardest when the system finally came to an end.
A great deal of those people lost their ability to work in downtown Los Angeles because it took almost 3 times as long to get from Watts to downtown as it did on Pacific Electric in the commute times.
When they took that Long Beach line off, they replaced it with 4 different bus lines. One was called the Freeway Flyer, one was the Alameda Street Local, one was the Compton. I mean, it was mind-boggling. The timetable looked like an accordion.
For the people who worked odd hours, it became impossible because it took 4 hours to commute for an 8-hour job. And a lot of those got out after 10 o'clock at night, and there just was no way for them to go home. So when you study the records, the unemployment rate in Watts just skyrocketed the day the Pacific Electric went out of business.
And that day came shortly after midnight on April 8th, 1961. It came despite all the petitions and all the protests, despite all the letters to newspaper editors. All along the line, motormen slowed their cars for those gathered along the tracks to shoot home movies and take snapshots. Sunset finally saw an end to the picture taking and an end to the big red cars. There's no shortage of irony in the story of the rise and fall of the world's greatest electric railway, irony that continued long after its demise.
Come ride on the RTD with us, we've got a better way.
With its buses bogged down in traffic and schedules running as much as 4 times slower than the old red cars, the MTA became, with a straight face, the Rapid Transit District.
Now, I grant you that a bus threading its way through traffic is not always the fastest thing on wheels. Los Angeles is the most spread out city on the face of the globe, so naturally it takes us longer to get places.
Years later, a new MTA was formed, this time committed to rail service as part of a transit mix. The first order of business was to reestablish service along the PE's 1902 Southern Corridor from LA to Long Beach. Mindful of the irony, the new MTA painted some of its cars in the colors of the Pacific Electric. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: the Pacific Electric came at exactly the right time and at exactly the wrong time. New York was already New York at the start of the 20th century. San Francisco was San Francisco. But Southern California was waiting around to be invented when Henry Huntington began laying his tracks. Tracks that would send Los Angeles down a different direction from older, established cities. People who would have moved into the center of Los Angeles to be near jobs and services found they could remain right where they were and commute. They could enjoy open space without regard for travel time to the city. it became a uniquely Southern California lifestyle, and one that certainly continues to this day. But the time in which the world's greatest electric railway system was conceived and built would also prove to be its undoing. As the 20th century began, the electric interurban cars were the ultimate in transportation, and there was no reason to think that things were going to change, or how fast things were going to change. When it was clear that the automobile would have an impact, the tracks of the PE were already rigidly in place. Changing them would become more and more expensive with each passing year. Transportation experts agree that Southern Californians are unlike any other commuters in the country. If that is true, the reason why can be traced directly back to the Pacific Electric, which in 1902 told them they could go anywhere they wanted whenever they wanted to go. As we said at the beginning, several bits and pieces of the PE remain in and around Los Angeles. Some have become landmarks of a sort, though most memories don't go back far enough to make sense of them. To younger generations, they're simply curiosities, oddly disconnected from the metropolis that surrounds them. Some rolling stock remains here and there. A car became a museum in Seal Beach. Another became a restaurant in Hollywood. At the Orange Empire Railway Museum in Paris, California, they've managed to coax some red cars back to life. While not in Ralph and Wayne's league, visitors can ride back and forth over several hundred yards of track. Out in back, a few more cars wait for possible restoration. Some are in reasonably good shape, others a bit more desperate. Of those who were the principal players in this story, Henry Huntington's name is the most prominent, even though his association with the PE lasted barely 10 years. The company he founded to provide electricity for the red cars would become Southern California Edison. The company that provided the fuel to generate the electricity would become the gas company of Southern California. By the way, his dislike of Sherman and Clark didn't stand in the way of business. Moses Sherman ended up on the LA Board of Water Commissioners and, shades of Chinatown, had a bit of inside information about water coming to the San Fernando Valley. Personal dislikes aside, Huntington partnered up with Sherman and some others to form the San Fernando Land Development Company. Henry Huntington brought in the Pacific Electric. William Mulholland brought in the water. The rest is history. For all their ups and downs, Moses Sherman and Eli Clark died very wealthy men. They're buried next to each other at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. After years of sparring with Huntington, E.H. Harriman, president of the Southern Pacific, did not live long enough to see the Pacific Electric finally come under the full control of the Southern Pacific. He died in 1909. His son was distinguished statesman W. Averill Harriman. And remember Judge Robert Whidney, who got together with friends and founded LA's first transit system because 5 blocks was too far to walk? He also got together with friends to draw up the first plans for the harbor at San Pedro and to found the University of Southern California. Most of those who worked for the PE when it was at its peak have passed on. Great-grandchildren are left to puzzle over the caps and uniform buttons that remain behind in boxes, tucked in the corners of closets or stored in garages around LA. And all those people, many of them just kids, who went out to take snapshots and home movies of the Pacific Electric, who understood its importance and its place in history, They and millions of others knew the pleasures of a time when you could go anywhere you wanted, any time you wanted, for $1 on any Sunday in Southern California.